Perfect. Well, let's call the meeting of the Mobility Stakeholder Group to order, and let's start with a roll call, please. Start on my right. I guess I got to dictate that part.
Dominic Franzella.
Deirdre Robinson.
Are-
I don't think I'm supposed to be.
You're not supposed to be here. Ignore the last name, please. Jose Campos.
Katrina Salazar.
Joe Petito.
And Mr.
Don
Driftmeyer.
Driftmeyer.
And Don Driftmeyer on the phone. Gotcha. Got a quorum. First item on the agenda is approval of the minutes from the March 22nd, 2018 Mobility Stakeholder Group meeting. I would welcome a motion.
Move to approve.
Got first.
Second.
Got a second from Ms. Salazar. Any discussion, questions, input from the public? Call for the vote.
Jose Campos,
Yes?
Don Driftmeyer,
Yes.
Dominic Franzella,
Yes.
Joe Petito,
Yes.
and Katrina Salazar.
Yes.
All right, that motion carries. Topic 2 is discussion and possible action regarding the ongoing determination of states' substantial equivalency to enforcement best practices and disciplinary disclosures under item B2. Mr. Franzella, were you kicking us off here?
Sure. Happy to.
Thank
So,
Dual role.
the purpose of this agenda item is to provide the Board of Accountancy the opportunity to establish a framework, or at least consider establishing a framework for continuing to make determinations regarding other state boards of accountancy's substantial equivalency related to enforcement practices, and then the necessary disciplinary disclosure. This topic.
Keep going, I think it'll come back.
This topic has been discussed by the MSG and the board for, this is going on a year now, related to having an ongoing presence and an ongoing role, related to discussions on ongoing oversight related to states' enforcement practices and disciplinary guidelines, or disciplinary disclosures. And at the previous meeting, at the March meeting, the last MSG meeting, I guess, the CBA directed staff to work with the chair and NASBA to gauge NASBA's interest and to discuss creating a methodology for conducting a state-by-state review, as well as a timeframe for that review. We did reach out to NASBA. We worked with Chair Campos, and NASBA has expressed a willingness to assist the CBA in its ongoing efforts, but at this time, it'll be more of a staff active role, with CBA staff taking the primary lead on collecting the necessary information. So what you have in Agenda Item 2 is really a proposed pilot program related to how the CBA staff are proposing we collect certain information, where that area, where the risk assessment would take place, how would we go about collecting this information. And so beginning on page, it looks like 3, you have the analysis, the table, and it covers 4 sections, 4 different categories that we would use for the purposes of collecting information to perform the state level determinations. And in category 1, this would be items such as board funding, changes in staffing level, and pending legislation that may affect enforcement. Category 2 would be disclosure of disciplinary information, use of disciplinary flags online, and proper disclosures and disclaimers online. Category 3 would be determine how enforcement referrals from the CBA are handled, and also determine if discipline imposed is appropriate for alleged misconduct. And Category 4 would relate to peer review oversight activities. Much of this draws from the law itself in terms of some of the data points, such as how they handle CBA enforcement referrals, how they handle discipline imposed, or are they imposing discipline appropriate for the alleged misconduct. Other areas that we drew from were the enforcement best practices, such as ensuring there's proper funding for a board's enforcement program, do they have appropriate staffing levels, and then the disciplinary disclosure information, as well as the disclaimers that the board has in association with its online search tools, also draw from the law itself. again, staff are recommending following these procedures for what we're considering maybe an initial or a pilot review, having not undertaken this type of review before. Staff will evaluate the process and findings, determine what adjustments should be made, bring that back to the MSG. We are proposing to look at 3 states initially: Texas, New York, and Oregon. These states had the highest number of either licensees practicing through the prior mobility or through prior practice privilege or through out-of-state firms under this present mobility program. And selecting Oregon was also more geographically based, to have a state close to California. We anticipate that we would start performing these reviews in early to mid 2019. And then in attachment 2, we've provided the proposed survey that we would send out after we've done an initial review of information available either on NASBA's websites, the board's websites, CPA Verify, and other information that we could just collect in the office. And those pieces of information we can't collect, we would be mailing out the survey and working to get responses that way. After the information were to come in, staff will assess it, we'll review it. Depending on the information we see, we would reach back out to the state, maybe engage NASBA to get additional information, or working with the state to help us collect information, or maybe make some corrections related to certain findings that we may have. And then we would only bring those matters that to the board's attention that really warrant further consideration. So at this time, again, this is more of a pilot program and an initial concept for review. I'm happy to turn discussion back over to Chair Campos, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Yeah, and maybe to step back a second and just put this in context and just the journey we've been on, right, with this area. Obviously, there was a heavy lift in establishing mobility. To begin with, the legislation required us to do many things that were accomplished with the final issuance of a report by this committee and the CBA to the legislature. So that process and the work behind it all took place, and it was a heavy lift with a lot of stakeholder help. And states, participating in something that was new to them. With the idea of consumer protection, the concept of some level of continuous monitoring, just like we do with all other aspects of enforcement, appears to be something that, we wanted to pursue and was the subject of discussions before. Nothing like what the detailed roll-up that occurred in the initial phase or the initial work to support the legislative mandates that we had. And so what probably does not jump off the page with the documentation is that the concept that staff and I participated in dialogue, I think, over the last 7-8 months in terms of what does this framework, we're trying to establish a framework for this monitoring. And it is not meant to be an intrusive process into other states' business, but rather something that gives us data points to allow us to perform our duties in a top-level risk assessment type of mode. And so a couple things I would emphasize, there's some focus on the survey, but the survey in the context of all of this is meant to be but a tool in the arsenal of risk assessment data points that we as a committee, that we as a board, and that staff would have to assess if there are any instances of jurisdictions having activities or issues that would warrant reevaluation of the mobility privilege, right? And so it's meant to be a top-down risk assessment approach. The memo and all the details walk you down some very specific factors that we thought were relevant. But I think even beyond doing a survey, and correct me where I go astray, there are various available research and data points that the staff would be able to avail themselves of for any part of this review. And it's buried within the memo into different categories, but let me just reiterate them. One of the key aspects of the law was internet disclosure of discipline. And that is a fairly simple process. It takes time, but simple process to assess, monitor whether that is still being done by jurisdictions. Secondly, there is, under category 4, we talk more about peer review, but there's peer review data information that we have probably through our PROC and through other processes that we have that feeds information already with respect to other jurisdictions. There's obviously news, press releases, information, you mentioned lawsuits, there's other data points that might be out there that might inform or give us something that might trigger a question or a follow-up item. Another thing that was specifically in the law was around how are referrals that we send to other states handled. And so that clearly, we would have, while the other states have their process, right? Once you refer something, they're going to have their process that is going to be confidential and subject to just like our own processes, right, for handling referrals. But that'll give us some level of information. And then the last thing I'll say, and I'm sure there's other things, is already available and already utilized NASBA information, right? So there's already focus questions. There's sections on NASBA's website of information that informs us. And so that are obviously all data points. I think as we discussed with staff, part of the idea was it would seem appropriate that there be some questions that are asked directly of the leaders of the different jurisdictions, and that's where this concept of the survey came out. And it was not viewed as you fill out the survey or else kind of thing, right? This is a tool we're utilizing to support our process, and the hope would be that states would fill that out and return that. And it's meant to be a pretty high level, very few questions that are targeted in certain areas. But there likely would be follow-ups, right? The absence of a return survey by itself isn't a problem. It might lead to working through NASBA, and part of the reason that we wanted to have NASBA assistance in the process, or it might be follow-up calls or other means of communication where we could get information. But let me just stop there because I think that just puts some of the details that are in the materials, but it's meant to be in the context of an overall framework. And before I stop, I know we've got a number of stakeholders, including NASBA and other individuals. So please feel free to, if there's something to input as the discussion goes along, you don't have to wait till we get to public comment at the end. Please just step up to one of the mics and we'll engage in dialogue. But let me just stop there and see what our committee members have to say.
So, Mr. Chairman, I agree with you. I think the elements that you articulated, particularly those 3 elements, the internet disclosure review, the peer review, and then the tracking, which I think is the most important element, the tracking of what happens with our referrals, are frankly the most important data points that we could have. Kind of to use your analogy, tool in the arsenal, that's kind of the nuclear kind of options. I think the survey, would either equivalent would be like the pea shooter. Not only because the data points aren't useful, but I think they're misleading. You started out by discussing what a great and comprehensive job NASBA did with that review. Not only did we get a significant amount of data from them, we got their decades of experience with each state. To try to replicate that by asking 1 or 2 questions, I think it's frankly would be misleading. A perfect example is what happens with funding. If one would look at California a couple of years back, the state appropriated $32 million of our funds. Well, could one infer then that our enforcement capabilities deteriorated? No, they didn't, because we had sufficient other funding. So I think it's a fool's errand to try to cherry pick some questions out of that very comprehensive review when we have 3 other examples that I think are much more informative. And frankly, I think we're going to spend a little time discussing each of those points. So, for example, staff, and I appreciate the work they did a good job, just articulated the peer review process. But there's probably no more important program to the profession and to the public from a regulatory perspective than peer review. It's the core of the whole regulatory structure, the audit. And if a state doesn't get peer review right, it's really, one could argue, well, you can get all the funding in the world, that doesn't mean they're going to be effective. So I think, we need to talk a little bit about when the staffs to the board looks at peer review, what are they looking at? They're looking at, how effective the program's put on. They're looking at how they deal with disciplinary actions under peer review. I mean, that in itself, frankly, I think is a significant wealth of data. The other thing, we're blessed with not having a lot of referrals to other states, but to the degree we do get referrals, I think we ought to go into significant detail of what happens with those referrals by other states. How quickly does the state take that referral? How quickly is that referral brought to a hearing basis? How adequately is the staff, taking care of that referral? So that, to me, that would be the second most important thing, and again, illustrative of how effective that enforcement is, particularly because it's on point with mobility. They're dealing with mobility. If they can't handle well a mobility referral, how are they going to be handling everything else? And I think the third point is one that speaks for itself, is the review of the internet, disciplinary procedure on the internet. That's a crucial part of the statute. It's very clear. I think once we go down the survey route, I think you identify the problem because these questions in and of themselves have to be simple questions on the survey. They invite significant amount of follow-up. Well, that's staff time. And I assume staff are doing something else right now. I mean, they're busy. And so to the degree they have to follow up with staff, I mean, these are enforcement staff, aren't they? So somebody's got to either we're going to have to add more staff or somebody's going to have to put, the pen down on one job and have to track somebody down on the, XYZ Board of Accountancy. And I can imagine they might be less than enthusiastic to respond. It's one thing to get a question from NASBA, which is why we asked NASBA to do that. And, all respect, it's another to get it from the Board of Accountancy. So I think we have enough data. I would suggest that since it is a pilot program, that we start with those 3 data points, which is a significant amount of data for staff to have to gather anyway, and then see at that point, do we need additional data? And that can inform whether we need a survey. And what kind of survey question?
Okay.
As opposed to kind of throw it out. Can I keep going? I've got a couple other points.
Well, so I get your point on the survey, and it doesn't sound like you like the idea of a survey, and so I think I got that point.
That's an oversimplification.
So what's the other point?
Esther, I think it's a disinformation. I think it's harmful. Because
Okay.
I think to try to pin the significant analysis that NASBA did and try and articulate it in 1 or 2 data points, I think frankly, either you do the whole thing or you do nothing. It's undermining what was done. And in addition, the ink isn't even dry on the study that was done. I mean, we literally have just got that delivered from NASBA. And so to go back out and, to redo that study, not only is it a question about the use of resources, but when you look at, we do peer review every 3 years, right? We do CPE why would we be doing this every year? So there's a question of timing as well. As to
And
why
timing wasn't specified on here, at least I didn't think it had been. And so obviously we were talking about a framework. The execution of this obviously will remain to be figured out, right, in terms of what are the appropriate touch points for this. But go on.
Well, but the timing for starting the program, I think we mentioned 2019, but as I said, it doesn't seem like the data we have is going to be stale anytime soon. So I would even suggest that there's no urgency to starting this, and in fact, it gives us time to better perfect that. Remember, as you know, we're the only state in the country that's doing this, and I think it's a concern if we don't do it correctly and thoughtfully and use significant amount of time to work through it. So I would argue that, we do it in a 2-prong approach. We try to get all the information that you and I just articulated that's publicly available, work through that, come back, have staff come back to the board, and then the board can do that analysis. And I think at that point, we'll be able to figure out, do we need additional information? Should we be raising more questions? I think it's a more efficient use of staff resources.
The only dilemma with that is none of those is a touch point with the jurisdiction. none of those ask a question of a jurisdiction, right?
But it answers the
But I-
question of whether a jurisdiction's enforcement is competent, is still substantially equivalent. I mean, that's what we're looking for. We're not looking for answers to data. We're looking to answers to the question, and the question is the state still substantially equivalent? Is its enforcement capability still up to as good, if not better, than California? And my suggestion is there are other ways to get that to that point. Peer review being one, how that state responds to disciplinary provisions being two. And as I said, I'm concerned that if we send the staff down a rabbit hole of having to follow up with all these data points, what do we do if a state doesn't respond? They might not want to, they might consider the information privileged, or they might not want to provide that to us. So it opens a whole host of questions when, admittedly, we have a reams of data that are already available without having to go the survey route.
Okay. Anybody else with any input?
Not at this time.
Thanks, Don. Go ahead, Dominic.
My only point would be the data point that, about the other states' enforcement practices on my referrals or the referrals that this board gives. One of the data points that was mentioned was how they handled that particular referral. Well, if it gets closed on their end, much like on our end, we're not going to find that information. We're not going to get a lot of valuable information out of that other than it's closed. We won't know the process that it underwent, how it kind of, I'm not saying that's good, bad, or indifferent. I'm just saying if we just rely on that one data point as kind of a benchmark, it could leave us in a position where it's really hard to evaluate that particular state when we refer those things over.
But like any other item, right, it's
Yeah.
in the context of all the other things that you're trying to look at.
Well, I would suggest that we try to determine what the disposition was, that we would ask the board. It
That
seems like that's
trickier than even a survey.
well, it seems like it's a legitimate question to say, tell us about the outcome of a case we sent to you, Board of Accountancy. I mean, that's a legitimate question. I think it's more legitimate than, gee, what's your budget look like for the last year, and do you have any litigation pending about you? I think states frankly talk about litigation back and forth to try to identify outliers. So I would propose, a more detailed discussion other than what we've had now about the types of questions you would ask and the information you would get from the other states on the cases that were, on the referrals that were sent to them. Just in the same way, I would like to have staff flesh out what they would like to see through the analysis of the peer review. There was just a one sentence or one, 4-word reference to peer review program, but I think it would be worthy to see what staff thinks they can get from that program. I think from having experience in my firm that you can get an awful lot of information of how well a state undertakes its regulatory program by looking at how it does its peer review program. And there are so many, points within peer review you could look at.
Okay, I think I got it. We've got a couple guests at the table who probably have some input. Mr. Ross or Mr. Fox?
Sure. Good afternoon. I'm John Ross here on behalf of the national accounting firms. I may be taking this up to 10 or 15,000 feet from where we've been the last 10 minutes, but I thought it would be useful, at least a couple of useful observations perhaps to inform the analysis around this question that relate to what the legislature intended and what I think we all intended when we passed this law and why we did it. I think there's a undercurrent perhaps in some of the materials that the law requires an ongoing assessment and review of each and every state in the country, and at least on that point, I would express a legal disagreement. I think the law says that on or after January 1, 2016, this board has the authority to turn a state off, but the law in and of itself does not dictate an obligation on this board to go out and review each and every state on an ongoing basis. It required that review at the outset in the context of a change in the law where we were now admitting without notice or a form licensees from around the country, and the criticism or concern expressed in the legislature at that time was, what do we know about what these other states are doing? And this process we came up with that was then executed through NASBA was a way to say, okay, level set, are we sure that all these other states are at least comparable to us fine. What do we do going forward? After 1116, if you have a problem with someone, you retain the ability to tell them they have to go back to the old system. And so I offer that, you should consult your lawyers and reach your own conclusions, because that's not my job in this role, but at least that's my view of it. Now, that doesn't mean, by saying that we think there's nothing for you to do or would suggest that you do nothing. I just want to say, I think it's a policy question, not a legal question. It's a policy question of what you think is right to fulfill your obligations to protect the public. And I think the spirit of what has been proposed is all being suggested in that light, that we want to undertake a process that is protective and that informs decisions to remove a state. But it's not, I wouldn't read into the law an obligation to look at each and every state. And I think our concern in seeing a proposal for a national survey, or eventually a national survey, is it sort of presupposes that you need to extract information from every state, whether or not you've had a problem or not. So I guess my second point would be, in doing this, scale. We've got 10 or so complaints over the last 3 years that mobility has been in place. I hope those numbers are close. You'll correct me, Dominic, if I'm off. Very few recently. That's a fraction of the overall complaints that this board sees. So I think, I'd want to make sure that the activities undertaken are both proportionate to the risk and proportionate to your obligations. And I just want to make sure that in considering this, there isn't driving this a sense that you're obligated to look at all 50 states, because I think what was assumed and intended was you'd have a tool to deal with a bad state, but not a continuing obligation to act as the regulator of all 50 states.
Appreciate that.
I would just echo Jason Fox, the California Society of CPAs. I would just echo John's comments. And, I think there is some validity to, if the board's looking to develop a dashboard, whether it's a formalized dashboard to kind of gauge the enforcement guidelines and standards of all the various state boards, to start with the data points that are available through the relationships with the NASBA, through relationships informally with the personal contacts of the boards of accountancy. That might be a starting point in working from there, rather than a survey that might be less well received, open for different interpretations when they're completing that survey, because I think when you put in, you might get bad data back, and that might lead down a rabbit hole of other questions. But I think there's certain data points that the board can tap into to start with that, and then move forward and help inform the next steps from that. So
Appreciate that. Other input from committee?
I will, Katrina Salazar, I will say I do believe that this is being done to protect the consumers. I don't have a thought on the frequency, but I do think we have the data points, and I think it's incredibly important for our staff to be looking at the information that is available to us on these different categories, to be alerted to changes. So I am, my opinion at this point is that I would leave the written communications to if something rises to the level of concern based upon what the staff is monitoring on an ongoing basis. But that would be my recommendation. I do like the categories and the value there.
Yeah. So I would not halt work on a survey. I do think we need to be prepared with a tool that allows for a communication. How that tool is used, I guess, would be a matter to be decided in terms of, is there a frequency? Is this a blanket peanut butter approach, or is this a targeted approach as a follow-up tool, or what? But I think, continuing to have that in the arsenal of tools would be a good thing. And it's already gotten some thought, but, by no means has timing, has methodology for how it would be executed been decided or proposed, frankly, by staff at this point.
Could I make a motion then, in that regard?
You sure can.
So my motion would be that the staff flesh out, particularly the criteria under the 4A peer review and 2A and C, evaluation of state disclosure, and so 2A, B, and C, and 3D and A. These are all basically the non-survey questions. flesh them out, that the state, that then come back to the board with a proposal, that they then go out and gather data under those 1, 2, and 3 to present back to the board, at which point the board can determine whether that data is sufficient or additional data is needed either through other research or through a survey. So flesh out the request, the proposal that's currently written for the non-survey issues to gather that data, present it to the board, and then make a recommendation whether that data is sufficient or whether additional data, including a survey, is necessary.
Okay, I've got a motion from Mr. Petito. I'm not sure I fully understood the motion. Did you jot down the specific sections? Okay.
Would it be appropriate to request a friendly amendment to the motion before we?
You
have a
could.
second? I would ask for an amendment to include pending legislation in that list, because although it is a survey question, there is some movement nationally with states having an interest in deregulation, and so I think it is relevant for us to track it, and I believe it is already tracked through possibly NASBA's website. I mean, there are resources, so it's not an outreach, and I think that is not a challenging task, maybe, with what's available.
I think I agree completely. That's a
So
very
that would-
good point.
That would add 1C to your list of multiple items.
Okay, so it sounds like you've accepted the friendly amendment of
Yes.
adding 1C?
I'll second that then, I guess.
Well, that was already included, so I was,
Oh.
yeah, so everything that wasn't included on the survey, what's included on the survey is 1A and B, and 3B. Right, so that was what the survey was going to include, 1A, 1B, and 3B. Am I correct, Dominic? Everything
Yeah,
else,
I see what you're, okay.
so everything else
There's,
was staff
Understood.
research. So everything else was staff research.
Okay.
The survey questions were essentially 1A, 1A and 1B, and 3B. So my suggestion was to, go back. I think we really need to flesh out what staff would do under the peer review program. I think we'd need a better idea, just what kind of research they would do. And then collect all the data from everything that's listed except for the 1A, 1B, and 3B, and present that to the board with a recommendation as to whether they think that's significant enough data, or do we need more research, and/or do we need a survey? As opposed to going ahead and just doing the survey and having that get caught down that rabbit hole. So that's my amendment. So yes, I agree with you about that legislation.
I misunderstood, I did not understand.
Well, I didn't articulate it well.
Extent, so.
Was it 3B
Okay.
as a boy?
I'm sorry?
3B that you don't want? Just so I understand.
3B,
Crossing
yeah, so
stuff out as I
that
go.
was my
Okay, thank you.
understanding, those were the 3 items you were gonna put in the survey. Right, 1A and 1B and 3B were gonna be in the survey. So to collect the data for all the other items except for those 3. And then to see.
so I got a first and a second. Do I have any further discussion or input from the committee?
No, I won't venture to think.
It sounded like, no, you did not want to put any comments in.
No, I think enough was said. I do appreciate what staff is doing. One of the things that was left out in the conversation is what NASBA is continuing to do.
Yeah, so I think what I got, the tail end of your question was, one of the things that maybe doesn't jump out in the discussion is where would NASBA provide input or help? And I think that was laid out in the memo a bit into different areas, and I think, just like we did with round 1, right? There were cases where there were questions that came out of the process, and NASBA collaborated with that state to make sure the correct perspective came forward, right? And that the right data and information and responses came forward. I would envision that the same way, because none of this process is meant to be a quick, this leads to decision A or decision B. It is meant to be a process to make sure there's a sharing of information, and not meant to be punitive, not meant to be just, blindly followed. So I feel the current motion is somewhat limiting. I'm probably not necessarily in favor of not having the totality of the framework, vetted out and continue to be worked on by staff. But, that's the motion we've got on the table. Ms. Salazar?
Well, I mean, it seems that, so I just want to make sure. So the motion is to strike essentially to eliminate the survey.
The motion is to do a two-phase
Right.
project here.
Okay.
To do everything but the survey first. We had a discussion that seems to be
Yeah.
a significant amount of data that staff can collect publicly available or with NASBA's assistance. Evaluate that and see whether we need additional data.
So since we're still discussing it,
Yeah, we're still discussing.
why put the reins on staff for another meeting? Just 3, let them look at it, flesh it out, report what this data would look like without the survey. And so my question is, why would we wait another meeting if we seem to agree that the existing data points could be?
So your concern
Useful.
is
I
that
mean, you
waste
would-
another meeting.
Well, I'm just wondering, we can have the staff give us more information about what they would be looking at from peer review oversight activities for which they're gonna have to go actually use 3 test cases and go see what it looks like. So I guess my question is, seems that we could get some preliminary information without stopping them.
I would not object to that. So to basically cut out the having them come back and us review what they recommend. So just have them go forward and do that analysis, and then at our next meeting, present the proposal to us
Right.
with the data and their recommendation as to whether they need additional data.
Right, because I think that process will inform. I mean, this really is just
With that,
just
well,
to
they've heard
see
this
what it would
discussion,
look
and
like. Right.
they'll have to flesh it out anyway as part of the gathering the data, yes.
A lot of discussion. Let's ask staff if they understand anything of what we're talking
I
about.
think I do. So that helped clarify, that was one of my questions, and so I think you clarified that. But I just wanted to clarify, so if we use these first 3 states as sort of our pilot, and we gather this information on the data points, and staff is satisfied and feels like it can come back to the committee with a recommendation that we're satisfied and we don't believe there's any problem with that state, is that sufficient, or would the committee want the data that we collected to be presented in the MSG item?
So I didn't envision them making a determination as to whether the 3 states are substantial or equivalent, only that the data is sufficient to make that determination. Or, gee, we can't make that determination because we need more data. So that was what I was hoping. What prompted that was Jose was saying this is kind of a pilot. We're trying to figure out what data to get to make the determination. And so I was going to, my suggestion, my motion was that the pilot be the data that's limited to the non-survey information, and then have the board come back to us at the next MSG meeting saying, we have sufficient information from everything other than the survey questions, or no, we don't think there's sufficient information, and therefore we can't make a determination.
So just for clarification, so we would be gathering that information. So when we
Yes.
come back to the MSG with that recommendation, would you envision and expect to see the data we collected that we're using to say we believe it's sufficient, or just that based on the data we collected, we believe it's sufficient? So for example, if we found a lawsuit in a particular state, or we found the disciplinary disclosures, would you actually want to see all that, or do you just envision you're looking for us to say, based on what we found, we believe this approach is sufficient? Just so
Latter,
as we're
yes.
preparing the item, that would be
Correct.
helpful.
That's right. Based upon this approach, we believe it's sufficient.
second.
That's
Okay,
exactly
thank
right.
you.
Mhm. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I agree with that. Yeah. Any other input? Any more clarifying questions? Any input from the public? Let's call for the vote.
Katrina Salazar,
Yes.
Joe Petito,
Yes.
Dominic Franzella, Don Driftmeyer,
Yes.
and Jose Campos.
No. Motion carries. All right, next topic. Item 3 is discussion regarding the mobility activity report, which I would just say is great work in pulling that together. And I know it's an evolving document and yet another data point that would be utilized and part of our process.
And I'll keep this incredibly short. It really is just data-driven information from various program areas, including licensing, which handles the out-of-state firm registration, just general contact information and website usage. I guess for this committee, the most salient information is probably on the last page, on page 3, related to the enforcement activities. And it shows 3 calendar years worth of data on that. The one item that we will be adding to this activity report, a new section, will be NASBA activities. So we're tracking things like their annual meetings, any updates that they're going through, certain activities that we used to track during the MSG meetings in the past. Same with any changes to CPA Verify, ALD. We'll start adding that information into this report, so it doesn't have to sit out on its own. We do track the enforcement activities in terms of revocations, both for practice privilege holders and the out-of-state firms. All that information is there for the past 3 years. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Chair Campos, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Any questions on the report?
Got a question. Do we track the number of California licensed CPAs that have been sent to California from another state? So the reverse of what we were just talking about earlier.
Sorry, I didn't understand.
So the number of California CPAs that practice in other states under mobility. If another state says we have a problem with a California licensed CPA in our state and sends it to California for file, do we track that? I just wondered how many California CPAs under another state's mobility are being sent here.
So you mean complaints against
Yes.
ours? Okay.
Right.
Yes, we do track it. I can't guarantee that we've tracked it historically, but it's something we've identified recently to make sure we have that data point, and so we can start trying to incorporate that in.
I think that'd be
And
helpful.
we
I mean,
can,
we are quite a volume of CPAs, right, and they're practicing elsewhere, so. Good question.
So
Any
we'll-
other questions for Mr. Franzella? Don, I'll give you a chance since you're by phone, probably on delay.
No.
Thank you. Emphatic. All right, item 4 was written report.
Do you need a motion to adopt?
I don't think we need to adopt the report. Yeah, it's just a standard report. Item 5 is any public comments? All right, meeting adjourned.